Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Michael O'Neill is a relevant radio host, author, and creator of the website miraclehunter.com, the top online resource on miracles cited worldwide in news articles and books, including throughout renowned Mariologist Father Rene Laurentin's comprehensive work, The Dictionary of the Apparitions of the Virgin Mary. O'Neill is a graduate of Stanford University and a member of the Mariological Society of America and the Theological Commission of the International Marian Association. Has been interviewed about his research numerous times for features on Catholic television programs like EWTN, News Nightly, and Bookmark, the secular media like Fox and Friends, Live Science, and the Dr. Oz Show. He was a consultant for National Geographic magazine December 2015 cover story and map about the Virgin Mary, the most powerful woman in the world, and was interviewed as the Marian expert on the corresponding television piece for Nat Geo Explorer. He served as the expert commentator during the 2010 live broadcast of the first Marian apparition approved in history in the United States at Champion, Wisconsin, and EWTN's coverage of the 100th anniversary of the Mass of Our Lady of Fatima. He's the host of a weekly relevant radio program, The Miracle Hunter, and a frequent contributor to the Drew Mariani Show. His books include Exploring the Miraculous, 365 Days with Mary, and 20 Answers, Apparitions, and Revelations. He was the co-host of the television special Miracle Hunters and is the creator and host of the new EWTN docuseries, They Might Be Saints, about the lives of future saints and the research for canonization miracles. He gave a presentation at Georgetown University, delivered the keynote address at the Catholic Press Association, and was accepted to present a paper at the Fatima Congress in Portugal, and was selected to give a lecture on miracles in Catholicism as part of the Interfaith Comparison Project at Drake University. I'm very pleased to introduce Michael O'Neill, and I hope you'll welcome him now. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here today, and I've seen more than a few familiar faces in the crowd, so happy to be here. Today we'll be talking about miracles. In fact, maybe that's all I talk about all the time. Anybody who listens to my radio show knows that for guests to be on the show, they have to say the word miracle to even get on the show. So that's kind of where my focus is these days. But I've been looking at miracles for a long time. Even when I was in Boston years ago, my secretary came running into the door one day, and she brought her camera in, and she said, "Mary is appearing on the side of the building." She had actually stopped her car in the middle of the street next to the hospital in Milton, Massachusetts, to snap some photos. And she wasn't the only one. All the cars in the street were stopped. Thousands of people gathered to see this image of Mary supposedly appearing in the window. Well, as you can see in the close-up, it doesn't look a lot like Mary when you really look at it, but from far away it sure does. This made the news, and they actually had to remove the window because so many people were going and praying and holding vigils, and nobody could go into the hospital when they were sick. There were some healings outside, but they really wanted healings on the inside too. So miracles are happening all around the world, as we know, and they're really inspiring to all sorts of people. And so in today's, I always say in today's show, but we're not doing a show today. Today's presentation, we're going to talk about what is a miracle. We're going to look at how the church investigates miracles and what types of judgments that the church gives. So what is a miracle? People have all sorts of different definitions of what might be miraculous. I mean, I think if you lose your wallet, or if you get a job, or if your wife marries you, you might say that is a miracle. But in the technical definition of a miracle, it's something that's inexplicable, outside of normal experience, has good results, something that's worked for the good. If something is just inexplicable, it's just a marvel, it's just interesting. But if you can show that God is behind it, that something good is worked out of it, then it's potentially miraculous. And of course, people ask me, what miracles have I seen? And being in Chicago last couple of years ago, there was a baseball miracle, supposedly. and a political miracle, of course, in the same year, depending on the stripes of your baseball team or your political party. So it might not be work for the good for everyone. So what is the role of miracles? We only have to look at the Bible to see that miracles embolden and liven the faith of people. It proved Christ's divinity, and it established the church, and he gave a divine mandate to the apostles to work miracles as well, to grow the young church. After the Gospels, of course, we have the insights of saints and apparitions and otherwise. And one thing that's really important to remember is that belief in miracles, even approved ones, are not required in our faith. So when you're looking outside the Gospels, we don't have to believe in any miracles at all. If you don't think that the healings at Lourdes really happened, if you don't think that the tomb of Our Lady of Guadalupe is a miraculous image, if you don't think that Mary really appeared at Fatima, you don't have to. The church doesn't say to get into heaven, you have to sign in the dotted line for these things. It's completely optional, which I think is a great way that the church handles it. So this is the disclaimer slide, unfortunately. There is a little bit of a danger in pursuing miracles and focusing on them. I know that sounds very funny coming from a guy who calls himself the miracle hunter. I hope God has some forgiveness for me for chasing miracles, but miracles are not a substitute for absolute faith in God. The centrality of our faith is found in the words and works of Jesus Christ. And we shouldn't look at miracles to satisfy curiosity or desire for magic or wonder working. Now, there are so many different types of miracles in our Catholic Church. People focus on healing miracles in the Protestant world and otherwise, but there are so many other strange things that are fantastic and confusing, and when we get to heaven, if we get there, we'll have lots of questions why God did it this way. But one such miracle is the stigmata. Of course, it's a picture of St. Padre Pio. The 50th anniversary of his death is this year. I'll be going to Italy to lead a pilgrimage there for that 50th anniversary and sing the other miracles of Italy. This, of course, are the wounds of Christ manifesting on a person's body, typically saints. And the Catholic Church never approves stigmata while the person is still alive, because that would be like calling somebody a saint if they walked around with an approved stigmata. So only after death would they possibly comment on it. In very few cases throughout history, there have been authentic weeping statues. This is actually a photograph of something that happened in 1953 in Syracuse, Italy. A couple that just got married, the Yanuso family, they had been given a gift, a plaster image of Mary. And the woman actually lost her eyesight and had extreme medical problems. And they began to pray in front of this image. Sure enough, her eyesight returned, and when it did, they saw tears falling from the eyes of this statue. Scientists looked at it, they x-rayed it, they couldn't figure out what was going on. Different people held it, they wiped off the tears, and they still came back. Hundreds of miracles were claimed. The whole town showed up at the doorstep of the Yanuso family. This was such a classic case, an approved case, that the Pope hopped on Vatican radio to announce to the world that there was a statue of Mary crying. That's never happened before, so you can consider that an approved case. Most cases, of course, of weeping statues are leaky ductwork behind an image, and so that's just the case. But there have been approved images, and this one was caught on film, actually, of the tears of Mary falling from the statue. Incorruptible bodies. This is, of course, St. Bernadette Soubirous, the visionary at Lourdes. There have been about 300 to 400 cases of incorruptible bodies, which means when the coffins were opened of these saints, their bodies were perfectly intact. It gets complicated beyond that, how long their bodies decay or don't decay, but this is an unexplained phenomenon in science, and they can't really explain how this happens. Eucharistic miracles. It's my favorite type of miracle because science can validate them. There have been so many cases throughout history where they've looked at these and they found the blood type to be type AB. They're all AB. And if you look at the Shroud of Turin and they tested that blood, that is also type AB. It's interesting, isn't it? But perhaps my most interesting point in Eucharistic miracles is that Legnica in Poland was the most recent one this past year. Scientists investigate these and have found that they do not know on a consecrated host that is bleeding, they can't see where the blood or the host in the bread transitions to flesh. It's not like there's a lump of flesh placed on the host. The transition is seamless, so they can't explain how this happened. Now I've got a picture, of course, of Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio here, our Pope Francis, in the 1990s in Buenos Aires, Argentina, he was part of a Eucharistic miracle. He was, in his diocese, there was a discarded host that was found, and it was put aside like is the standard practice in water. And when that priest went back to it, it was turning red, blood red. And they called upon Jorge Bergoglio to figure out what to do next. They sent this host to New York City to a scientist in New York who was an atheist. And the scientist said, well, you sent me a piece of tortured flesh and blood, and why have you sent this to me? And of course they told him that this was a consecrated host, and is now verified as body and blood, truly. And that atheistic scientist actually converted to Catholicism as a result of his study. And so that was one of the great cases of Eucharistic miracles, and there have been hundreds of them throughout the ages. And of course, anybody who's been to miraclehunter.com, my website, knows that I catalog Marian apparitions, and this was the big year for Marian apparitions, the 100th anniversary of Our Lady of Fatima, the gold standard of all Marian apparitions. And I was so lucky to be there on the 100-year anniversary, leading a pilgrimage to be with Pope Francis and 1 million of his closest friends. It was great to be there. And lucky for me, I was with EWTN that day, so I wasn't packed in with everybody else, so it was a little bit easier for me. Now, one of the projects that I've worked on in my life as the Miracle Hunter is the National Geographic that came out December of 2015. I was so excited to get that call from National Geographic. In fact, I thought it was one of my friends playing a prank on me. Because if I had to name any magazine that I'd love to have a cover story about Marian apparitions, it would be National Geographic. I didn't think they'd ever do such a thing. But it was so special that they quoted me in the article, and I did all the research for that article. I was the consultant. And of course, they wanted to make it a very secular article and talk about how Mary wasn't really appearing and how it was a hoax. But I worked with them almost every single day for 2 months, and I fought them and fought them and fought them. And I never really knew what the article would turn out like. I didn't see it in print, but it was absolutely beautiful. They treated the Virgin Mary with great respect, and Catholics and Marian devotion with great respect. So it was a very special project to be a part of. My favorite part of that magazine was the spread of Marian apparitions that they did from around the world throughout history. This is something I worked on with them. They took the data from my Miracle Hunter website, and they listed all the apparitions in the different categories of being approved or on their way to being approved or condemned, apparitions to saints, etc. And so this was really special to get to make this map. And so when you look at Marian apparitions in particular, you can look at the data, and you'll notice that I was an engineer in a former life, so you'll see a lot of charts and graphs. If you look at the data, that shows that the number of claimed apparitions, for example, throughout history has been pretty stable until the 20th century. There's been a huge spike in claims of Marian apparitions. And if you look at the 20th century in particular, the 1980s and the 1990s have had a huge spike beyond that. So people are claiming visions of the Mother of God more than ever these days. And I've got some ideas why that might be happening. The largest spike in apparitions happened starting in 1981, which of course are the famed alleged apparitions at Medjugorje. The majority of people who have claimed apparitions after 1981 have gone to Medjugorje. That doesn't mean it's true or it's false or it's apparition by contagion. It just means there's a connection there. I don't know what it is. So people ask this question all the time. They say, well, this apparition or that apparition couldn't be true because it isn't a typical apparition. Well, there's no such thing as a typical apparition. It turns out Mary can appear however she wants, as many times as she wants, wherever she wants. But if you go through the data on my website, and I've crunched all the numbers, a typical apparition would be one that happened in Europe. It turns out that Spain, France, and Italy are Mary's favorite vacation spots. She goes there the most. The average age of a visionary is 16 years old. The average number of visionaries is 2. They're usually students, shepherds, or religious. And the number of visions is 7. And the average duration is 3 months. Now, for the data processing, I struck out the ones that have thousands of appearances in order to get those numbers. So, if you go through the data, what is the most typical of all Marian apparitions? Fatima's close. It's pretty much down the middle of what the most typical Marian apparition is, but it's in Giertzwald, Poland. in the year 1877. So it happened in Europe to two children, 13 and 12, Justina and Barbara. They were shepherds, they had 9 visions, and it lasted for 3 months. So that's pretty much the standard Marian apparition. And this was approved by Cardinal Karol Wojtyła. You might know him as Pope John Paul II. And if you look at more data, you'll see blue lines are for boys and pink lines are for girls. You'll see that in some cases there are a single visionary represented by 1 line. In other cases there's a cluster. Sometimes it's all girls. It's never all boys, but a group of boys. But in these cases on the far left you'll see St. Juan Diego, who was 57 years old when he received his visions of Our Lady of Guadalupe. All the others are kind of in that standard range of teenagers to a little bit older. So these are the most highly approved Marian apparitions in history, so it shows that there is a variety, but the ages are usually pretty young. It's worth noting that some of the apparitions that have been approved lately in our Catholic Church, such as Betania, Venezuela, Maria Esperanza, and also in San Nicolas, Argentina, Gladys Mota de Quiroga, they were in their 50s when they received their apparition. So the trend has been going to older people, not just children. Another thing that you'll hear people say is, well, if Mary appeared to me when I was young, for sure I would run out and become a priest or a nun. For sure that's what I would do. If the Mother of God was visiting me, that's what would happen. And if a person doesn't become a priest or a nun, it couldn't possibly be an authentic apparition. Well, again, if you look at the data of 67 approved visionaries, only 10 out of 67 entered religious life after receiving visions. Of course, this is Sister Lucia Fatima, Bernadette Subaru of Lourdes are the famous examples of people becoming religious after those visions. But it doesn't mean it's true or not true. It doesn't connect. So that's one thing that people say all the time. The other thing that people will say is, well, Mary can only appear, 7 times, and that's all she'll visit for. She won't stay for longer. Now, the fact of the matter, there have been a number of cases where she appears just once. At La Salette, 1846, Knock in Ireland, 1879, and numerous others where she appears just a singular time. There have been other cases where she appears thousands of times, like in Kibeho, Rwanda. She appeared to the children there, and that was many thousands of times. In 1664, in Our Lady of Lelot, France, Benedicta Rencourel, in Our Lady of Good Meetings, she received a daily apparition after the age of 40 or so for her entire life. So she received thousands of Marian apparitions, and that was approved in 2008 in the Catholic Church. So we don't really know. There's no real formula. And so, Pope Francis has made a lot of comments about Medjugorje, and I'm not here to promote or condemn Medjugorje, but he says that Mary appears every day there. That can't possibly be true. Well, there have been cases where she has appeared every single day. So it's pretty interesting. Pope Francis hasn't been to miraclehunter.com yet. Hopefully someday soon. So it's really interesting how the church looks into miracles. This is a fascinating thing. So throughout Catholic Church history, there has been a ping pong match, so to speak, between the bishops and the Vatican, as far as who's in charge of looking at miracle claims. And so maybe ping pong match is kind of a nice way of saying it, because it's more like a hot potato. Nobody wants it. So it goes back and forth throughout the ages over who's in charge. In fact, I've talked to different bishops and they say, of all the things that I don't want happening in my diocese, I don't want the Pope to visit, and I don't want somebody to claim a Marian apparition, because in both cases the logistics are just insane. So, but starting the Council of Constance in 1414 and going into the Council of Bale, they looked at the visions of Saint Bridget of Sweden, one of the greatest mystics in the history of the Catholic Church, who had visions about such things as the Crusades and church doctrine. And so she was someone that they really looked to, but didn't know how to handle her visions. And so that was the first time they talked about what to do with a visionary. At the Fifth Lateran Council, the Vatican then took over to decide on apparitions and visions. At the Council of Trent in 1545, they ping-ponged back to the bishops, and that's where it remains even today. And the bishops are the ones who are in charge of declaring an apparition or a miracle true or false. If the local bishop says something is false, but other bishops say, no, that looks pretty good, doesn't matter. The local bishop is the only. Lambertini, when he was a cardinal in Italy, he wrote all the rules for canonization miracles. So all the medical healings, and he talked about things like incorruptible bodies, how even if a saint is incorruptible, that doesn't count towards a sainthood cause. And so he wrote this down in his document, De Servorum Dei Beatificazione et de Beatorum Canonizatione, that's a mouthful, 1840. And they still use these rules even today, the Lambertini criteria, used at Lourdes and used in Rome in canonization causes. And the 1917 canon law document says, you have to talk to your bishop before you publish anything about miracles. That's not true anymore. In 1966, Pope Paul VI lifted that and said, you no longer have to talk to your bishop. You can publish away. And so it's so interesting because in the Dictionary of Marian Apparitions written by Father Laurentine, he has two sections to the book, all the apparitions before 1966 and all the ones afterwards. Well, this is a dictionary about this thick, and more than half of the dictionary is dedicated to after 1966 apparitions. So that opened the floodgates to people talking about their apparitions in the media. Now, healing miracles are the most common of miracles in our Catholic Church, and some people in this audience may have gotten a healing miracle. And one thing that I hear all the time, people email miraclehunter.com all the time saying, you know, I had this healing, pray for this healing, we're looking for a healing. Who will investigate my healing? And there's a common misconception, if your Uncle Joe or a relative or a friend is cured from cancer or otherwise, the Vatican does not send out a miracle hunter to your house to take notes on what happened and report back to the Pope. It just doesn't happen. There are only two places in the Catholic Church where they actually validate medical miracles. One is at Lourdes, those famous apparitions to Bernadette Soubirous. They have that spring there where people go and bathe in the spring. And there have been 69 cases approved by the Church. Over 8,000 have been deemed remarkable. The other place is at the Consulta Romana in Rome. That is the Church's body that looks at canonization miracles and finds out, was this truly miraculous? So when we look at miracles and canonization, it has to be the intercession of a singular saint. I don't know about you, but when I'm in trouble, when I need a miracle, I'm praying to all my friends, the saints, hoping that somebody picks up the phone. I'm just hoping that anybody out there will answer that. But when it comes to canonizations, you cannot pray to Saint John Paul II and Saint Mother Teresa and your other potential saint, because the Church will say, well, we think it was John Paul II working that miracle, not this new saint you're claiming. So you and your family and friends only have to pray to that singular saint. So, you know, cases like Fulton Sheen, of course, it's a famous bishop who is on his way to being canonized. Now, he should be beatified any day now because his miracle has been approved for beatification. And the story goes that a child was born, stillborn, in a home birth, and they rushed the ambulance to that home and went back to the hospital. It was so many minutes later where the child had no heartbeat, could not breathe. And the mother invoked Fulton Sheen in order that that child might be saved. And they actually called all their friends and all their relatives while the child was being resuscitated. The husband was doing this, and they said, pray only to Fulton Sheen. And everybody was in prayer, and the child came back to life, was resuscitated. And the doctor said, don't celebrate too much because he is going to have severe mental deficits if he survives at all. Well, the child, James Fulton Sheen, is now older than 10 years old and is in perfect health. And everybody who prayed before he was healed and after even he came to, they all prayed to Fulton Sheen. So the Catholic Church said, this is for sure a case of intercession of a singular saint because nobody else was praying. In the case of Mother Teresa's canonization miracle, the man had encephalitis and was going in for brain surgery. And that entire parish of people were praying to Mother Teresa specifically. And so that was an easy one to approve because when they went in to do the surgery, the man woke up and he was fine, and everybody had prayed to Mother Teresa. So when it comes to canonizations, you need one miracle for beatification and then another one after you're beatified. Actually, there's one with John Paul II. The woman who was ill was watching the canonization mass on TV, and she said, "He looks pretty good. I'm going to pray to Saint John Paul II, or Blessed Pope John Paul II." And she was healed, so that was the closest call there ever was. It was after his beatification, but just barely. So there can be no signs in death, such as incorruptibility, that are used for a canonization. There can't be any signs in life, like stigmata or levitation or anything else that says this is a holy person. The church says, well, it doesn't prove for sure that the person is in heaven with God. They need to be interceding for a miracle. And a fancy Greek word, thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy cannot be used. It means wonder working. So even if the person has worked many miracles in life, it doesn't say anything about whether they're in heaven or not. We just had a priest canonized or beatified that was Father Solanus Casey from Detroit, Michigan. This was in November. This was big news. And I've interviewed Brother Richard Merlin, his postulator, on my radio show. And he has said that there are cabinets full of stories of where Father Solanus Casey, Blessed Solanus Casey, interceded for a miracle, where somebody would come to his monastery and they'd say, "Father, my brother got in a severe car accident," or "My mother is very ill," or "We're in great financial straits. Please pray for us." And Father Solanus, in his simple way, would say, "Don't worry, everything is going to be all right." And sure enough, the person would go home, and bingo, there were miracles, and they report that to the cause. But they could not even use these miracles to submit them to Rome and say, "Take a look, we've got miracles." Not at all. It added to his reputation for holiness, but couldn't be used for his beatification. So there was a woman who traveled to the grave of Solanus Casey, prayed to him for her skin condition, and she was healed. That was the miracle that was used. So thaumaturgy cannot be used. Now, when it comes to miracles that are in canonization causes, there are some very strict criteria. I like to say that it's a little bit of a miracle that any miracle has ever found. It's just that hard. And so one thing I'd like to point out is that there was this movie a couple years ago. It's called Miracles from Heaven with Jennifer Gardner. It was actually quite a good faith-based film, and I recommend that. And I was actually invited to interview Jennifer Gardner in Hollywood, and I got to interview the subject of that movie. Her name was Christy Beam. She was the mother, played by Jennifer Gardner. And in that story, she has a young daughter, Annabelle Beam, who has a severe gastrointestinal problem. It was so bad they took her to all the specialists in the area and the top doctors in the world who were in Boston. And that doctor said that there is no cure for her condition. However, we can try to help it a little bit, but she will die from this gastrointestinal problem. And so it was an extremely serious, and it was a depressing kind of scene to hear that in the movie. Now, the highlight of the movie, the key scene to the movie, is where you see Jennifer Garner praying to God, saying, "God, heal this miracle." And then the shot pans over to the girl and her sister playing in a large oak tree. And the tree branch cracks, and the girl falls 30 feet and cracks her head on the ground and has a concussion. And so you're watching the film and you think, is the girl dead? What's going on? It turns out that when she woke up from her concussion at the hospital, not only did she not have any broken bones or brain trauma or any problems, it turns out that her gastrointestinal problem was completely gone. Completely gone. And I don't know, I'm the miracle hunter, and I say that's a miracle. But they were a Protestant family, and so the Catholic Church has never looked at this miracle. It wasn't for canonization or at Lourdes. But hypothetically, if we were to look at this miracle, let's look to see how strict the Catholic Church's rules are, okay? So the disease has to be very serious. In this case, it was. The girl was going to die from the disease. It can't be in a stage to go away on its own, like a cold. It can't go away quickly. There can be no medical treatment given that's relevant to the cure. So sometimes treatments don't work. Sometimes there's no treatment, like in this case. It has to be a spontaneous cure. She fell from the tree, hit her head, woke up, and it was gone. It was spontaneous. It has to be complete, meaning that she can't be sick on some days, but fine most of the days. It has to be completely gone. And it has to be permanent. Usually they use the metric of 10 years. And she's been, it's been more than 10 years that Annabelle Beam was cured. And so you might say, well, what's the problem? This sounds incredibly miraculous. It passes all these criteria. Why wouldn't the Catholic Church validate it? Well, it's number 7 in this list. You cannot have a crisis or another disease which produces the cure. So the fact that she bumped her head could have been the reason why there was spontaneous remission of the disease. So they wouldn't approve it as being miraculous. So again, the church has never looked at this miracle, but the criteria are so impossible. So whenever they find one, it's a cause of great joy. When it comes to the shepherd children of Fatima, there was a young boy in Brazil, Lucas Batista, who also fell and cracked his head and was cured through prayers to the shepherd children of Fatima. And that was the miracle that was used. And that was my favorite moment from that canonization mass, where Lucas was presenting the gifts to Pope Francis, and he got a great hug from the Pope. You could almost see it in the face of the Pope saying, through you and because of you, we have this very special day where we're canonizing the 2 youngest saints in history. And so, aside from healing miracles, the place where they look at miracles so clearly with a special criteria is in Marian apparitions. That's the only other case where they have a very special way of looking at it. And so how does the church do that? Well, there was a secret document that was released in 1978. It's called the Norms of the Congregation for Proceeding and Judging Alleged Private Revelations and Apparitions. If you think that's a mouthful, try the Latin. It's a tough one. So, in this document, it says that a diocesan bishop can initiate an investigation, and only the diocesan bishop. So, a group of qualified faithful can go to the bishop, priest can go to the bishop, but he's the one who has to start it up. If that doesn't work out, where the bishop says, I'm in over my head, I don't know what's going on here, the National Bishops' Conference can intervene. Beyond that, the Vatican can intervene, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and they can investigate those apparitions. Now, in the entire history of apparitions, can anybody think of the one case where this has actually happened, where it's escalated from local bishop to Bishops' Conference to the Vatican?
Akita.
That is a good guess, and the Vatican was involved in some level there, and the bishops have been involved. But the classic case is Medjugorje. So the local bishops, 2 of them, have given negative judgments. The Bishops' Conference in 1991 issued the Zadar Declaration, which said, hold on, wait a bit, and we'll give it a maybe, we want to prove it. And in 2010, Pope Benedict started a Vatican commission to look at it. So that's the one case in history where it's escalated up in that order. And so we're still waiting to see what Pope Francis says about that. Maybe more on that later. So in that document, the church officials, they assess the phenomenon, the people, they study the orthodoxy of the messages, and they appraise the pastoral considerations. Are people returning to the sacraments? Are they converting? Are there miracles happening? So that's what they look at. So when it comes to the Episcopal, the bishop's investigation, it goes through this investigative process where they look at the science. Sometimes they'll attach brain scanners to the people during an apparition. They'll look at the orthodoxy of the messages, the theology. They'll also make sure all the facts line up in sort of a CSI-style investigation, and then it proceeds from there to a judgment. So what are the types of judgments that the church can give? There are 3 types. There's the wait-and-see judgment, the sideways thumb, where the church says, maybe yes, maybe no. There's the thumbs down, the negative, and the positive. So the wait-and-see category is the most common of all categories that relate to Marian apparitions and miracles, where the church says, it's okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but we don't have proof that it's officially happening. So they give this statement, non constate supernaturalitate. It is not established, it's not for sure, it's not definite that there's something supernatural here. So the miracle might or may not be supernatural. And there's nothing contrary to faith and morals in those messages. So theoretically, any of us in this audience could come up with some nice sounding messages. We could say, go to Mass, pray the Rosary, convert your hearts. Those are all good things that you could say, but that doesn't guarantee that Mary was putting those thoughts in your head or appearing to you. So the church will sometimes give some sort of approval of faith expression, and here are some classic cases of approvals of faith expression in our Catholic Church. And there was one actually in the United States, Our Lady of America, where the church hasn't officially approved it, but they say that it is okay that people express their faith in that devotion. Now, the more common case is the negative judgment, the constate non supernaturalitate. It is established that there is nothing supernatural here. And the devotion should cease. So that's the very negative one. And when that happens, when the church says, this looks bad, we don't want anybody involved with it, if you're a follower of that apparition, you should probably give up on it. The church is saying there's some danger to you, either theologically or financially. You might be giving your money to support a bad apparition. So what are the negative criteria? There can be a glaring error in the facts. There can be doctrinal errors attributed to God or to Mary. Believe it or not, there's one apparition where Mary says she's the fourth member of the Blessed Trinity. Do the math on that, it doesn't really work out, right? So there can be, if they're pursuing financial gain, if people are saying, yeah, pay me a few dollars and you can see Mary appearing, of course, that's a red flag. If the visionaries are committing immoral acts, or if the visionaries are just plain crazy, that is going to get knocked out by the church and say, that's a no-go. So there have been a couple of classic negative cases here in the United States. Mary Ann Van Hoof in the 1950s, she claimed visions in Necedah, Wisconsin. And believe it or not, there's still a shrine there to her today. And the church looked at these visions initially and said, this might be authentic. Well, let's keep watching this. So they watched, and then Mary Ann began to say, UFOs will descend to the earth and take the faithful to heaven. Well, you can't say UFO and hope the Catholic Church is going to approve it. It just won't happen. So that was ruled negatively by the Catholic Church. And even though they still keep going, they invented their own version of Catholicism at that shrine, still in Necedah. The Catholic Church wants nothing to do with them, of course. Another famous case was Veronica Lucan in Bayside, New York. In that case, again, there was a huge following to Veronica, where she had these ecstasies and claimed visions. And there were priests who were going, and they were remembering her messages, and they were propagating her messages, and the church stayed tuned. Unfortunately, Veronica said that Pope Paul VI had been abducted, and there was an imposter pope sitting on the throne of Peter. Again, you can't say imposter pope. It's just not going to happen, and the church approved that. So that was given the very negative judgment that I'm talking about. And one of the things that they look at in apparition claims or miracle claims is they look at humility. If a person is not humble, if they're looking for attention, grandizing, or looking for money, then the church is going to rule that out. So St. Hildegard von Bingen, who received visions herself, said, the person endowed with supernatural gifts never boasts of them, never flaunts them, and above all, shows complete obedience to ecclesial authority. This was Pope Benedict talking about her. So she had her own visions, but she said, I can't judge myself whether these are authentic. I need to talk to the church and see what they do about it. So there have been any number of occasions where obedience has been front and center. And one of my favorite stories of St. Philip Neri. He was called upon by bishops, actually, to go in and investigate cases of miracles and visions. And there was a nun who was claiming visions. And so the bishop sent him in. So he went into that convent. He looked around, he walked around, and all the nuns were waiting. And he walked up to the front of the room and said, well, my work here is done. I've looked around, and I came here to talk to a saint. And there are no saints here, so I'm going to go home. Running in from the back of the room was a nun saying, I'm the saint, I'm the saint, I'm the one you need to talk to. And he says, I think our conversation is finished. And he went right back to the bishops and said, no, this is not an authentic apparition. We've got an issue with humility. And so the positive judgment is the judgment that we are most excited about, of course. On those very rare occasions, 28 times in the history of our Catholic Church, has a local bishop, in fact, said, it is established as supernatural. Constate supernaturalitate. The supernatural character is established. Mary is indeed appearing. And there is nothing, of course, contrary to faith and morals in those instances. So the criteria they look at, the moral certainty of a miracle happening, the positive qualities of that visionary, the content of the revelations are good, and there are spiritual fruits, conversions, vocations, miracles that are happening. And so the local bishop will give his decision on that. And one thing that's so interesting, of course, is that the local bishop is the one in charge, but a subsequent bishop can step in and say, wait a minute, we're going to hold off a little bit before we promote this any further. Classic case, San Nicolas, Argentina. There was a vision starting in 1983 Gladys Mota de Quiroga, she received almost daily visions of Mary and of Jesus. And actually, Bishop Hector Cardelli, before he retired at age 75, he said, "Let me sneak this one in," even though the visions are still going on even today. And so the bishop coming in after him said, "Hold on, wait a minute, we're going to keep our eye on this, but we're not going to promote those messages like a supernatural vision." So even though the local bishop is the official designator of the truth of a vision, a subsequent guy can come in and say, "This is in fact, we're going to hold off and wait a little bit." Akita is another case. Bleeding statue in Japan, the other bishops have not really supported it as much as it was approved by the initial bishop. So I was so lucky to be with Relevant Radio on December 8th, 2010 in Champion, Wisconsin, where Bishop David L. Ricken announced that for the first and only time in the history of the United States, we had a vision of Mary approved as supernatural. So I'm going to read you his statement so you can hear what these things sound like. He said, "I declare with moral certainty, in accord with the norms of the Church, that these events, apparitions, and locutions given to Adele Bryce in October of 1859 exhibit the substance of supernatural character, and I do hereby approve these apparitions as worthy of belief, although not obligatory, by the Christian faithful." So that was a big day, the first and only time that's ever happened in the history of the United States. So I mentioned that a local bishop gives his statement and another bishop can come in and say, "Well, let's revisit this." But when the Vatican steps in and gives some sign of recognition, that's kind of like the cement. When the Vatican speaks on an apparition, that puts it in its place forever. So what the church may do is release some documents saying, "We believe, in fact, this is an authentic miracle." They may build a new basilica on that site. They might elevate a church to a basilica. If the Pope visits an apparition site, creates a blessing or prayer for that apparition, it's approved. Of course, Medjugorje, a controversial apparition, right? So Pope Francis was going to Sarajevo, which was not too far from Medjugorje. Some people said to Pope Francis, "Why don't you kind of stop by and take a little look around Medjugorje, see what you think?" He's smart enough to know that he sets foot on that shrine. The pictures are on the internet seconds later saying Medjugorje is approved. So the Pope never visits an unapproved apparition site. When a golden rose is given by the Pope or the papal legate, that is another sign. When a feast day is put in the general Roman calendar, then it's solidified. And when a saint is canonized, you can't undo that. There's no such thing as a saint lying about an apparition. It just doesn't go with the heroic virtue thing. So that's another case where if there's a canonization, it's an approval. So when the Vatican recognizes an apparition, there are two types of ones that it does. One is the traditional, the classic long-running apparition prior to the Council of Trent. So we have, some people here might be wearing a brown scapular, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. You say, well, that's one of the greatest apparitions in history, of course, but it's never been investigated by the Catholic Church. So it's sort of a traditional apparition. So starting the Council of Trent, 1545, that is when the Church began to look at investigating Marian apparitions. And so they look at science, theology, Mariology when they look at these things in a very slow process. 1664, Our Lady of Lay Low, approved 2008. In Champion, Wisconsin, 1859 apparitions approved 2010. So it takes a while before the church makes a judgment. So these are some of the cases of pious tradition. Our Lady of the Pillar, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and a number of others where the church says, this is an apparition that the church recognizes, but it hasn't gone through that investigative process. And there are a handful of others that have been recognized by the Catholic Church. Our Lady of Guadalupe was the very first apparition to be formally investigated by the church, according to those norms. Our Lady of Lay Low, 1664. The Miraculous Medal, of course, a famous apparition. Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of Lourdes, of Fatima, of the Lady of Knock, and Our Lady of Cabejo in 1981. The most recently occurring Vatican-recognized apparition where Our Lady appeared to some school children in Rwanda and predicted the Rwandan genocide of the 1990s. And so that was declared supernatural through Vatican recognition. So what should we do with Marian apparitions? Of course, they can be great points of inspiration for all of us. People sometimes latch on to the messages of an apparition. This has been the perfect year, the 100-year anniversary of Our Lady of Fatima. to look at those messages. We all know they happened 100 years ago, but they really brought to our attention this year, those messages of conversion and reparation. We all talk about has Russia converted, etc., but have we converted is the real question. Where is our heart at? Have we made reparation for our sins and the sins of the world? So some people will be devoted to the messages of Marian apparitions, but again, there's no obligation to believe in miracles, even though the church may say they're worthy of belief. But when we do get a negative judgment, it's always smart to follow the church's teaching, because they have in fact done all the investigation and we're just bystanders. Even the miracle hunter is just a bystander to miracles. We have to follow what the church teaches on those things. So thank you so much for your kind attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So on Akita, 1991, I was invited to go to Japan. I was a custodian of the International Pilgrim Statue related to Fatima, and there was a 4-day conference. The Bishop of Akita, Bishop John Ito, made a presentation. It was attended by many theologians and others. And one of the things that Bishop Ito said in his presentation was that those allocutions or messages that Sister Agnes Sasagawa received, and she received 2 miracles too, by the way, according to him, that they were very controversial, and it talked about bishops fighting bishops and cardinals fighting cardinals, and that fire would come out of the sky and destroy a lot of humanity, all of which sounds kind of like Fatima a little bit, but the bishops in Japan didn't like it, and the reason they didn't like it, according to him, was because it was not ecumenical. So he said he went to Rome and he met with Cardinal Ratzinger. He said, I want you to go back and do the investigation yourself, because he's the one who had the canonical jurisdiction to do that. And in his presentation, he said, I have found there's nothing in these that is not unworthy of belief, and so on and so forth. So the question that I have is, to what extent does the Bishops' Conference really have something to do with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And everything you said was entirely true, so thank you for that summary. So in those cases where the local bishop is unsure what to do, he is the primary authority. So when he punts, when he gives up sort of ownership of the project of an apparition approval, he will send it to the local bishops' conference. Without him doing that, the local bishops' conference has no authority whatsoever. He remains the single voice in an apparition decision. When it goes to the bishops' conference, where they want more people investigating, more comments on this from the other bishops, then the local bishops' conference has a true say. But really, it's between the local bishop and the Vatican. Those are the two going back and forth. And the local bishops' conference, if requested by the local bishop, can be involved, but otherwise not. But that's a great question there.
Yes, back in the back.
I'd be curious about your thoughts about Sacred Heart and St. Margaret Mary. I mean, if Christ himself was an apparition, shouldn't that be like top one? And then what was the story really with that? And then how can the church at one point have sort of had devotions to that, and then if it's Jesus and Christ himself, all of a sudden just dropped it? Like, what today you don't really hear any.
Sure, so it's a good question. The question is about what do we do with the Sacred Heart devotion? And of course, St. Margaret Mary Alacoque was the one who received those visions of Christ, and in the history of apparitions, there have been a few of Christ. We have St. Faustina, and we have St. Margaret Mary's apparitions of the Sacred Heart are the 2 primary examples of this. And the church never dropped that devotion, for example. It didn't say, let's take that off the calendar, let's not talk about that one, we're not sure about that. That is still a devotion that's front and center in our church, but it's a case of emphasis. So over the centuries, the church will choose to emphasize one over another. And your question is, this is an apparition of God himself versus the Mother of God or a saint or anybody else.
Right.
Why isn't this the one we only talk about or primarily talk about? Well, it's a matter of emphasis, and different popes throughout history have added devotion to the Sacred Heart, and so it all depends on the emphasis that local bishops and the Pope want to place on this. But it's still a big devotion in our Catholic Church.
So speaking of St. Faustina, here's something that had at one point at least been actually banned by the church, and then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but over time, it's accepted. What are your thoughts on that? Something that goes from negative to positive?
Sure, no, it's a great question. In the particular case of St. Faustina, she wrote her diary phonetically. So she didn't know how to take notes on those messages she was receiving. So when that went through to the censors and the people looking at those writings, they said, what is this gibberish? This doesn't make any sense. And so they said, we're going to give this a negative judgment, table this for now. Now, through Carol Wojtyła and others, that devotion became one of the biggest devotions in our entire Catholic Church, in our modern Catholic Church. And that's when people got a greater understanding, both theologically and otherwise, of what happened there. So, but it brings up a great point of what happens when the Church gives a negative judgment to something. How can it be flipped to a positive? And the fact of the matter is there are very few cases in history where that's ever happened. We saw one in Lipa in the Philippines from 1948. This woman, Teresita Castillo, a postulant there, a Carmelite postulant, she claimed visions of Mary. And last year, Bishop Raymond Arguelles opened that case back up and said, I declare it to be supernatural. And I actually had him on my radio show. And I tried to get him to say, why did you reopen the case? This had a negative judgment of the Church. And he kept saying, I have a great personal Marian devotion, and I personally believe in this. And I said to him, have you consulted with the CDF on this one? And he said, he changed the subject. And so I wondered, was something awry? And sure enough, several months later, after he made that public announcement, the CDF intervened and released a negative statement again, saying that his approval does not count. He didn't consult with us. We still believe the initial judgment to be true. Now, there's only one case that I know of, and then potentially there's others, but Our Lady of All Nations in Amsterdam, in which there were some visions that were claimed in 1945 by Ida Perdeman. And she was given a negative judgment by the Catholic Church and published in the AAS, which is the big Vatican monthly, quarterly document producing, verifying the documents. And in that document, they said that it has been given a negative judgment. The local bishop, Archbishop Marianus Punt of Haarlem, he said, this is an approved apparition. So that's the only case I know in history where a bishop has flipped a negative judgment that's been validated by the Vatican. So it hardly ever happens, but we have to be careful of those cases because usually when the local bishop finds something wrong with it in the first place, there's going to be reason that they do that.
Virginia? So in relation to that, so you mentioned that a couple of the bishops in Medjugorje are not approving. So does that have to change before just their approval? Do they have to now approve it before it can be officially approved?
It's a great question because the local bishop is the first and primary authority in the judgment of apparition cases. But because the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the Vatican is now in charge with the investigation, and Pope Francis will be the one giving the statement when he, whenever he does this, I don't envy him. That's a tough job. It's like an umpire in baseball. Half the crowd is mad, half the crowd is happy when you call a ball or a strike. So that's a tough job for Pope Francis. But when he does that, when Pope Francis says Medjugorje is approved or it is condemned, or we don't know, the local bishop can't pipe up then and say, Pope Francis, I disagree. He does not have that ability publicly to disagree with what comes out of the CDF on that. So we'll have to wait and see on that. Yes?
Virginia?
Do you think that the reason there's so many 20th century apparitions or reports is, number one, there might have always been that many, but we didn't have the ability to communicate with one another the way we did? And then the other thing would be that for those people who perhaps have more of a financial stake, they would also see the ability to pull in more money for those that, for untrue apparitions.
So I think the question of why so many apparition claims these days, one of them is modern media technology to disseminate messages. All these people who claim visions now have websites, so you can go and you can get the message of the month, or the day, or the hour. But so yes, modern media has changed that tremendously. But that 1966 document, The Right to Mass Media from Paul VI, anybody who had qualms about, should I see my bishop first, should I really make this public, now doesn't have to go talk to their bishop at all. So that's one of the biggest reasons at all. Is there money making involved now? Sure. And is that the motivation? I have no idea. But there could be, those are some of the theories of why there are so many more today. Yes?
Okay, Jim?
First, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I wonder if you briefly address the issue of the conversion of Russia. And while it may be apocryphal, I've heard or read that Russia may be instrumental in the conversion of Islam. So if that has any value at all, would you please address that for us?
Thank you. It's one of the toughest questions there is, and perhaps I should be inviting the executive director of the Blue Army of Fatima, David Carollo, in the back to answer that one. This is every talk I give this year, I think I gave around 30 talks about Our Lady of Fatima this past year. And that is the popular question that I get. And you'd think with all that practice I'd have a really polished answer. But has Russia been converted? Big question. Of course, we see all the things going on with Russia, perhaps being involved in our own elections, I don't know. Doesn't seem like a converted kind of country to a lot of eyes. But, does that mean that every person in Russia will be a practicing member of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church? Of course it doesn't mean that. But one thing that is interesting is that perhaps the open practice of faith in Russia is greater there than it is here. You cannot, you cannot make a public statement about your faith without people saying, don't mix your faith and politics. Don't make that known. You're condemned for such things. But in Russia, the faith is celebrated on some levels. Missionaries are preaching openly in Russia and bringing people closer to the faith, which wasn't allowed at some point before the Fatima apparitions. So the question is, has Russia been converted? I don't know, but the answer is a little more complicated than that, of course. We see great things happening in Russia with the faith, but has every single person, has Putin been converted? We can't say yes to that question, can we? So it's a complicated one, and I wish I had the answer for that, but again, we pray so much for the conversion of Russia. In our own families, in our own lives, we have to dedicate ourselves to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and convert the world through her intercession. Now, related to your question about will Russia convert the Muslims, I wish the answer was yes. I do not know. We can pray about that one, but we don't know that answer. Will Mary be involved in the conversion of the Muslims? I believe that wholeheartedly. So, but again, we don't know the answer to that question. Thank you for that. Yes, thank you.
I've appeared a number of times with Michael certain shows and throughout the radio and prior. And I guess on October 13th, I always get the phone call because Fatima was the
Yep.
But talk about the conversion of Russia. Okay, you talk about conversion, and everybody says, gee, the consecration wasn't made properly. This is a controversy that's around all the time. I say this in my talks, and you said the same thing. It's our personal conversion that truly counts. Okay, and you can get into the semantics of it, but you talk about Islam and Russia. Father Finelli was with me, 10 years ago. We were in Kazan because we were involved in the return of the famous icon of Kazan. And Kazan is a town in Pakistan, which is part of the Russian Federation. And remember our lunch with Archbishop Nini, who is the papal nuncio to Russia. What did he ask us? What did you want to accomplish in Russia? Are you trying to convert Russia? And we said, well, no. I mean, the conversion of Russia is first primarily the conversion away from atheism, primarily. And we said, but there are many displaced Lithuanians, Poles, Ukrainians, and that are Catholic that are here, and our outreach is more to them. And he was happy to hear that because what he said is the church sees it on a macro level. They see it at a much higher level where they're looking for a conversion, a reunification of the churches. Maybe that's way out there. But as far as Kazan is concerned, that's a town that's 50% Muslim, okay? 50% basically Russian Orthodox. And the Muslim community there was so welcoming of us. They even built a Catholic church, built with public funds. The Muslim mayor built with public funds the Catholic church in Kazan for the Catholics that were there. Okay. Will it be Our Lady? Will it be Our Lady of Fatima? Will Russia be part of it? I believe so, very much so, because I think you see it there. You see it in a place like Kazan, where they do live together. And unfortunately, there's always the radical part of Islam or anything that throws everything into a tizzy. But I do believe many people want to see that. I think Our Lady will be instrumental. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that bonus material from David Carollo. Thank you.
Russia, that Putin has done some things that we have not even done in our country. Like, they have developed crisis pregnancy centers near the hospitals to cut down on the number of abortions and encourage people to have more babies. We're not even hearing those kinds of things in America, so there must be some level. What about it?
So for those people who don't know, and this is quite a popular apparition, I get so many emails to my Miracle Hunter website, people asking questions about Medjugorje and any other apparition or miracle. But Garabandal is perhaps one of the most popular questions I get. So this is something that happened in the 1960s in San Sebastián de Garabandal in Spain to some young children. And one of the things that I think that makes it so interesting is there's video footage, there's film footage of these children receiving miracles or experiencing something where they're walking backwards at high speeds, and it's almost a confusing thing to watch to say, what is going on here? And the question is, has the church ever validated in any way Garabandal? The answer is no. So the initial bishop has said, he gave that non constat de supernaturalitate statement. It is not established as supernatural. Does that mean it's condemned? No. Does that mean it's approved? No. But every subsequent bishop who has looked at Garabandal has given the same exact judgment, that it is unknown, that we're still looking at it. But there's been no movement positively on this. One of the interesting things is that there was a man who was predicted to regain his eyesight as one of the signs that Garabandal was true. Unfortunately, that man has passed away without regaining his eyesight. And so that was sort of a negative hit to the supporters of Garabandal. But like Medjugorje, Garabandal will prove itself. In Medjugorje, of course, there is a permanent sign that's predicted. And there is a similar warning and a sign predicted in Garabandal. If the sign is there, thumbs up. If no sign, thumbs down. So it's one of those that will prove itself to be true or false, but the local bishops have never given outward sign that they are supportive of Garabandal. So thank you for that question.
Any other questions?
I have a question. A few years ago on the north side of Chicago, Eastern Orthodox Church had a weeping Madonna icon. Could you make any comment about that? We saw that, Miriam, with other thousands of people, and it really appeared that it was a real thing.
So I've seen that weeping icon or weeping statue as well, and the church was not able to validate it. But of course, if it's an Eastern Orthodox church, it is their investigators who look at it. So there's a slight difference between the Roman Catholic Church and how the Eastern Orthodox Church investigates miracles. For the Orthodox Church, it is often prayerful discernment only to say, let's gather and pray, is this authentic? The answers are typically yes. In the Roman Catholic Church, we're very obsessed with, get those scientists in there, let's look at this, let's analyze it, let's prove it false before we say anything true about it. So in this case, of course, it didn't go through that scrutiny of the Roman Catholic Church, so we don't know if it was an authentic case or not, but thank you for that.
In the case of the Protestant woman who told about that was praying for her daughter and the daughter seemed to be cured, why would the church be involved in it, or was she praying to a Catholic saint? Or?
No, so I guess my disclaimer was that that is an example of how, if we apply the rules of the Catholic Church to that very extreme miracle case, but the church is not interested in that case.
Any other
Thank you.
questions? Yes?
Michael, thank you for your excellent presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you on the radio.
Thank you.
As well. Have you been to Medjugorje?
No, I have not been to Medjugorje.
Could you tell us your favorite apparition site and why?
Okay, thank you. So my favorite apparition is Our Lady of Guadalupe. That nothing will ever top that one for me. Of course, this was a special year for Our Lady of Fatima, and she kind of took over the #1 spot for the 1 year, but Our Lady of Guadalupe has the highest place in my heart. And that's because we have a little miracle story in my family. My mother, when she was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, her own mother, my grandmother, fell away from the Catholic faith. And when that happened, she didn't only stop going to Mass, but she threw away all the rosaries in the house and all the statues of the saints. And not only cleaned house, but began to make fun of her own children. Why do you believe in these statues? Why do you worship Mary? And so my mother, an 8-year-old, was heartbroken that not only was this happening, but that her mother was losing the faith. And so this was in 1950s white America, where my mother prayed to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And like any good Catholic does, she made a deal with God. And she said, God, if you bring my mother back to the Catholic faith, someday, when I grow up, I will become a school teacher, and on every December 12th, I will teach all my school children the story of the miracle of Guadalupe with St. Juan Diego and your Tilma. And if you bless me with any children when I grow up, I will teach them every December 12th the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Guess what story? I heard a lot. So through that and my involvement with the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I wrote a paper on Our Lady of Guadalupe for an archaeology class at Stanford. And it was really that study that set me going to become the miracle hunter. So I attribute it all to Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Have you been to the site?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Very good.